I wrote a memoir because I am 78 years old and because I've had a life that is probably no longer available to other people. That's a good enough motive, and I just launched into it and went where it took me and was surprised at some of it. I began the memoir with a poem. I showed this to a friend of mine who's a poet, and she read it, and she said, I think we can do without the poem at the beginning. But, we're meant to go against advice, even of people who know more than we do, so I kept it in. Here it is. I grew up in a northern town. Ground was flat for miles around. We were fundamentalist, underwear was in a twist, aloof, avoiding those in sin, expecting Jesus to drop in. I was staunch and rather pure, riding on the Brethren bus. And then I read great literature, lusty, longing, humorous, before the flowers fade away. We were taught obedience to the word, God's holy book, but mother loved comedians, and that was the road I took. And so I bent and smelled the roses, which God intended, one supposes. And now as life slips away, just as scripture said it would, I write this little book to say thank you. So far, so good. It's true that I did grow up listening to comedians. I grew up listening to comedy shows on this big Zenith radio. It sat on the floor. It was about 4 feet tall, as I recall, and made of wood with columns like a temple in front. I listened to radio shows that don't exist anymore. I suppose on YouTube you could find them, but there they were. They came at us live. We listened to them at a particular time, a particular day of the week. I was raised in a rather strict fundamentalist sect called the Plymouth Brethren, which hardly exists anymore, but it taught us to avoid people who were in error with a capital E. So I grew up with no social skills, really. I was brought up to avoid people. I come from this large rural family, 6 children, and so I was fairly independent from about the age of 10 or so. And when I got on my bicycle, nobody ever asked me where I was going. You were free to go wherever. You could go down to the Mississippi River, the Mississippi River. You could ride into the city of Minneapolis. I did. When I was 10, I rode into the industrial section of town, past sawmills and printing plants, and past a slaughterhouse where you saw men who were stripped to the waist, who were carrying half beeves on their shoulders and putting them into trucks. I rode through Skid Row and past long rows of tramps that were sitting on the railing waiting to go into the Union Gospel Mission. And I went off to the library to read books. And if I came home before supper, before 5 o'clock, nobody asked me where I had been. It was an independent life, which I think is rare for children that age. Nobody was worried what would happen to me. I was not a good student. I was an indifferent student all the way through school, but I had some wonderful teachers who took an interest in me. And all you need is a few. I had the privilege of going off to the university when tuition was $250 an academic year, a year. And so you could put yourself through school on a part-time job and pay your living expenses too, which meant that you never had to ask your parents' approval of the courses that you took. And so you could put yourself through school on a part-time job and not get into debt, which left you free to consider an unlikely career, such as writing fiction, which I did, since I had no social skills and so forth. I did, however, have 18 aunts who all loved me, so I did not lack for self-esteem, I think I could say. And growing up in the Brethren, I came to believe that the creator of the universe had confided in this tiny band of believers revelations of truth that he had denied to the rest of Christendom, the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury and all the others. And when you are able to believe this, that God, who created the Milky Way and all the other galaxies, has confided in this little group of people sitting in this room on a Sunday morning, it's not hard to imagine other things and to believe that you may grow up to write books. And I believed in that. You can just take it on faith somehow. I graduated from college and I was fairly unemployable, which was a lucky thing, because if I had had real job skills, I probably would have wound up in corporate America. But instead, I invented work for myself that lasted me for 40 years. I founded a radio variety show called A Prairie Home Companion, which was broadcast live on Saturday evening, which combined all odds and sorts of odd things, and old jazz and gospel and old rhythm and blues and monologues about my hometown of Anoka, and sketch comedy with a couple of beautiful sound effects men doing whinnies and snorts so you could do westerns. We had mating dolphins and loon cries and unintelligible public address system announcements and rockets going off, and dogs could talk and recite poetry. There was French gibberish and all kinds of varieties of flatulence, which, believe it or not, the public radio audience, even though college educated, many of them, they did enjoy articulate farting. And it all took place on public radio stations that otherwise tried very hard to sound like the British Broadcasting Corporation. I'm pretty sure that none of this is likely to happen again. So I owe the world a book about how it came about. For the sake of unemployable people who are aiming at unlikely careers, I owed an honest account of my life, to say that it can be done. Failure is not to be denied. Failure serves to close doors to hallways going places that you shouldn't have gone down anyway. I wrote the memoir in little bits and pieces. I didn't write it from beginning to end. I wrote it out a sequence over a long period of time, kept coming back to it. And when I was done with it, or thought I was, I read it from the front to the back, and I discovered that there had been a clear structure to my life. I hadn't understood this before. I never had seen it before. I found two tragic flaws and several crucial factors, including a determinative family history that really sets you on your course, and a whole series of very significant accidents that turned out to be pivotal, and a string of important failures that, as I say, closed off avenues that led nowhere, and a few miraculous events, including the times that I avoided sudden death by stupidity, and also the day that I walked down a gravel road out in the country. I walked past a girl's house, and she called out to me. She called out, "Do you want to wrestle?" And I was 11 years old, so was she. And I walked into her yard, and she took hold of me, and she threw me down on the ground, and she sat on me. It was very thrilling. And she said, "Let's see you try to get free." Well, I didn't want to get free. She was a very independent-minded girl. She was a daring young woman. She kissed me on the lips, thinking I would be disgusted, and I was not. She taught me to sing the doxology to the tune of Hernando's Hideaway, which I had never heard before in my life. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly host. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. She taught me that song many years later, after a couple of failed marriages. I met a woman who reminded me of that girl, age 11. And I had the good sense to fall in love with her. And we've been married for 25 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. I grew up in Minnesota, the icebox state, on the banks of the Mississippi, which I learned to spell when I was 4 years old. So I imagined that I was smart. I grew up in a family that loved the King James Bible. So I was the only child in my elementary school, Benson School, who used words like behoove and propitiation and vouchsafe. I loved that word, even though it set me apart from other children. I didn't mind. I tried to be normal in other ways. I played baseball, but it was sandlot ball. It was not Little League. There was no adult supervision at any time. And one time, playing first base, I bobbled an easy pop-up. It was right up there high in the air, and I had my eyes on it, and my glove was up in the air, and it bounced off my chest, and 2 runs scored on this error. And the jeering and the heckling of the other side, mocking me, were of course, traumatic to me. It was 1952, and empathy was very rare on the public school playground. The bullies were operating freely back in the day. They picked on thieves and rich like me and showed no mercy. So I was a target. One of the Darwin brothers, one of the bullies in our school, came up behind me in the boys' lavatory and yanked my pants down when I was standing there at the urinal, and so I peed on myself. I was brought up not to hit people. I was told many times, don't hit. So I didn't. I just stood there in shame and humiliation and tried to dry myself off with paper towels. And soon after that, a boy in the class told me that my teeth were green and they were rotten. And he said this with such conviction that I believed him. And pictures of me from that age on show this solemn, unsmiling boy who in time grew up to be this solemn, unsmiling man that I am today. My teeth are not green. I know this. My dentist has told me. But in my mind, they still are. Well, this may seem sad or even tragic, but the lack of a big smile helps to keep a person out of politics and out of retail sales. And it's no handicap at all for a writer or for somebody in radio. So I should be grateful to this boy who told me that my teeth were green. And I am grateful to him, and I am sorry that he is dead. He was the smartest boy in the class. He was a successful student. He finished medical school, and when he was 32 or so, he was married, and he had 2 little children, and he was trying to repair a water pump in his basement, and he turned off the power. He flipped the circuit breaker, but somehow it flipped closed again. And when he stuck a screwdriver into the pump, he was electrocuted. It killed him instantly. I, on the other hand, never had the skills to even attempt to repair a water pump. And so I got off very easily. I had a 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Molenbrock, Fern Molenbrock, who saw that I was picked on by bullies, and she was sympathetic, and she let me spend recess in the school library and escape from the Darwin brothers. And there in the library, I made friends with Huckleberry Finn and Jim and Penrod and Laura Ingalls and her sisters and the 3 Musketeers, Black Beauty, and so forth. Green teeth and deep pantsing and a pop fly that was dropped and the derision of classmates led to a preference for stories over real life. And there's my life story. My aunts enjoyed stories. They loved jokes. My uncles were more serious men. They knew about engines and carpentry and how to lay concrete, and they disdained people who did not know about this. So I avoided the garage and the experts there, and I gravitated towards the kitchen with the humorists and the poets. And there you are. I was a bus kid. When I was young, I rode the yellow school bus 12 miles to Anoka Junior High, back and forth, day after day after day. My stop was the last stop, so the bus was full as it pulled up, and I had to climb up onto the bus and find a seat, and they were all taken except my friend Corinne Gunsel offered me a seat next to her. She was sitting next to Elaine Ness, and she moved over and I sat up front with the girls. The boys all sat in back defending their seats. And so your heterosexuality is confirmed, even though you may not know the word yourself. I was in the 8th grade when I tried to go out for football, to become more normal, but I could not pass the physical because of this congenital mitral valve prolapse, which I was born with. And so I didn't go out for football. I walked into the offices of the Anoka Herald. There were 2 newspapers in town, and this was the lesser one, the failing one. And I asked the editor, Mr. Warren Feist, if he needed a sports writer, knowing he did not have one. And he hired me thinking that I was the son of my uncle Lawrence Keillor, who was an executive at the First National Bank of Anoka, who was an important advertiser in the Anoka Herald. And so under false pretenses, I came to fall in love with newspapering, publishing, the linotype machines and the noise they made and the smell of hot lead and the big flatbed press down in the basement and the stacks of paper, my byline on the inside back page of the Anoka Herald every week when it came out. The simple series of accidents, the being on the last stop and sitting with girls and wanting to be manly and play football, but forbidden due to a heart problem. I was hired to write about football, thanks to my successful uncle. And so you arrive at destiny's door. It's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of pure good fortune. Be grateful for it. I went off to college at a time when the University of Minnesota accepted anybody, and I wrote incomprehensible poetry. I thought it was the way to show that you were brilliant. Obscurity was a wonderful cover for ignorance and lack of experience. And I learned to write anguished poems, such as you'd expect of destitute orphans. Poems like the leaves turn brown, the leaves are falling, death is all around us. That sort of poem, which they're still writing nowadays, some of which got published in literary magazines on heavy paper, with stippled edges. But one day I sat in the periodicals room of the library at the university where those magazines were kept on open shelves. And I sat there for 6 hours, and I never saw anybody walk up and open up a literary magazine and read it. And I thought to myself, if that is prestige, then the ultimate honor would be to be embalmed and put in the ground. I looked at my poetry more closely, and I thought, why write suicide notes if you are not going to walk up to the railing of the bridge? Why waste your time? And so I switched to writing comedy. I got a job in radio because they needed somebody to work the 6 a.m. shift, and nobody else wanted to get up that early. Having a mournful face was no liability whatsoever, and they gave me the job. It was a classical music station, but I knew they couldn't fire me because there were no replacements, so I played Jelly Roll Morton. I played the Beach Boys and Chuck Berry and the Golden Gate Quartet, and I told jokes. I read the local police report. I took requests from people for their birthdays. I wrote limericks. I had the freedom to do as I pleased because I was the only one who would get up that early in the morning. I was 27 years old when I sent a story by U.S. mail to a famous magazine in New York, the New Yorker magazine, 25 West 43rd Street. Every other writer in America did the same. And my story was fished out of the slush pile by a woman named Mary D. Kierstead, who sent it up to the editors, and they bought it. They paid me $500 at a time when my rent was $80 a month. And that settled everything for me. If you could earn that much money with a piece of writing, that was it. The die was cast. The prestige of the New Yorker magazine out in mid-America and elsewhere, public radio being extremely status conscious, was my ticket to do a Prairie Home Companion, the live Saturday night show. And there is my life story. No social skills, not many other skills, but I took that 6 a.m. opening, found an audience. Some people in New York liked something that I wrote, and doors opened. And there I was. I was a lucky man. Both of my grandfathers died at the age of 73. One was a farmer, the other was a bookkeeper. They were hard workers. And to them, the idea of making a career doing work that you love was completely alien. But that's what I did. And here I am at the age of 78, still having a good time. My mother was a Brethren woman. She was a true believer, but she loved comedians. She loved Jack Benny and George and Gracie Allen, George Burns and Gracie Allen, and Fibber McGee and Molly, and I craved my mother's love. So I invented the first show in public radio that did sketch comedy and included commercials, Bebop Rebop, Rhubarb Pie, the Ketchup Advisory Board, and Fritz Electronics. Everything you need is on the Fritz. Powder milk biscuits, heavens, they're tasty and expeditious, and the Federated Association of Organizations, and many others, so that we could come down from the high plateau of public radio talk, and we could talk about stomach upset and drowsiness at work, and PIN numbers, and the need for strong coffee, and expeditious biscuits that give shy people the strength to get up and do what needs to be done. My mother enjoyed all of this. She enjoyed that show. She liked our annual joke show, jokes like the one about the man who walks into the bar with a handful of dog droppings and says, "Look what I almost stepped in." And when she was very old, in her 90s, I told stories on the radio show about my mother. I made her a circus star, Grace the Great. She was a tightrope walker and a sharpshooter. And my dad was a clown. He stood blindfolded on the trunk of an elephant with a lit cigarette in his mouth, which mother shot with a pistol aimed over her left shoulder using a hand mirror, and the hot coal explodes into a cloud of sparks, and the elephant tosses my dad into a double backflip, and he lands on the elephant's back as his pants fall off, and the elephant steps forward on a switch that fires a midget out of a cannon who lands on Dad's shoulders, and the crowd goes crazy. I did this whole story with a sound effects man. It was quite impressive. And she sat at home and she enjoyed it at the age of 95. It made a big impression honor. That was my career, trying to win the love of my mother. You could pay money to learn that fact from a psychiatrist, but I learned it from writing a memoir, which then earned me some money, not much, but you know, it's a better deal. One more reason to think about you writing your own book. No, I had an interesting life. I learned all sorts of things. I quit smoking just by doing it. I just quit, and I hung out in no smoking areas, and I ate bags of popcorn, and after 3 days, the urge faded away. I quit drinking in the same way. I had an enormous capacity for alcohol, which made my wife very nervous. I could drink a couple of martinis and a half bottle of wine and a glass of cognac and still speak in whole sentences. But I didn't want to be a drunk. I didn't want to cause anguish to my wife or embarrass my little girl, be pitied by my friends. And moderation just did not work for me. But I dreaded the thought of joining a 12-step program, of which there are a great many in Minnesota, and sitting in a circle of folding chairs in the basement of a church and talk about my emotionally distant father. That was my motivation, really, was fear of therapy. So I just stopped. Fear of therapy. Counseling might lead to making discoveries about me that I did not want to know, so I just quit. My mantra was, it's easy to quit drinking so long as you don't drink, which works for other things as well. And I recovered those wonderful mornings that come to you when you wake up clear-headed and you have good ideas and you sit down to work and you feel cheerful. I had drunk alcohol to loosen up, so I thought, but actually it made me gloomy. Of course it did. Sobriety made me feel lighter, even giddy, silly sometimes. And I started writing silly verse for the radio show. I wrote limericks. The poet Sylvia Plath was torn up by sorrow and wrath. The day that she dove headfirst in the stove, she should have just run a hot bath. The great transcendental Thoreau went to live in the woods long ago and wrote lovely prose while his mom washed his clothes and fixed him hot lunches to go. There was an old man at Bay Ridge who cried out, son of a bitch. I got up in the night and on came the light, and I find I have pissed in the fridge. I read them on my radio show. And in the privacy of their home or their car, even high-minded, college-educated people enjoyed silly things like this, who maybe would not have if other people were looking at them. In public radio, people lust after prizes, especially the Peabody. And if you win it, then the phrase Peabody Award-winning appears beside your name for decades afterward. But there is no prize for limericks. The prize is that people sit in the dark and they laugh at you. There was an old man of Nantucket who died. He just kicked the bucket. And when he was dead, we found that instead of Nantucket, he came from Woonsocket. Kind of a groundbreaking limerick. I wrote a good one when I was quite young. An old fellow from Minnesota tried hard to write a great limerick. He tried, and some were not bad, but something seemed to be missing. This is the beauty of longevity and becoming 78. You attain this longevity by not sticking your screwdriver into a water pump that you thought you unplugged, but you did not. You get this view of your whole life trajectory, and you see how much of your life was decided even before you got your driver's license. A few weeks ago, here in New York, my ophthalmologist, Dr. Chaikin, told me that I suffer from the Duane syndrome. This is a congenital condition of the eyes that means that your eyes do not focus when you are looking up. You see double. And I remember that dropped pop-up playing first base when I was a kid. That had I caught it cleanly and learned social skills and developed a warm smile, I might have become a men's clothing salesman or a lobbyist for a coal company. Had I had only two aunts, more critical ones, maybe Unitarian, and had I been a good student, I might have become an assistant professor of English somewhere and written a book on the roots of postmodernism. I don't know. My friend, Corinne Gunsel, gave me a seat on the bus. And ever since then, I have preferred the friendship of women, which is a sensible thing for any man and a great advantage. Women are compassionate, men are competitive. It's a simple fact. Look it up. Had the mitral valve defect not kept me out of football, I might have chronic back pain at the age of 78 and a tendency to forget what I was thinking a minute ago. The heart problem runs in my family. It killed off two uncles in their late 50s. It ended my football ambition, made me a published writer at the age of 14. And in my late 50s, it was nicely repaired by surgery. And it gave me 16 more years in the show business. In those last years, I realized that thanks to radio, I had accomplished something I never set out to do. I had become a friend of people who, as an old evangelical and as a literary guy, I probably would have scorned in real life, some of whom now approached me in airports and they said, "Do you mind?" And they held up their little cell phone and put their head up close to my head and took a picture of the two of us together. This does not happen to serious poets. I became friends with a Republican, not the easiest thing for me, a Republican named Harry Blackmun. He was a Supreme Court justice, but he listened to the show. It's available to Supreme Court justices, same as anybody else, and he became a friend. And when he died, his daughters asked me to come to his funeral and to sing the songs that he had sung to them when they were little girls, and he came home late from the office and they were already in bed. He would sit down on their bed and he would sing two lullabies, Tura Lura Lura, Tura Lura La, and he would sing the Whiffenpoof song at the table down at Maury's. And so I did. I went to his funeral. It's at a big Methodist church in Washington before an illustrious crowd. And I invited them to sing with me. The Clintons were there. He was president, Bill Clinton and Hillary, and Al Gore was there, and a whole bunch of senators. And the 8 justices were all there sitting in the front row in their black robes, all sat there, and not one of the justices, not one, sang those songs about the little black sheep who had gone astray. They did not even move their lips. They did not even hum. This is what you get from being on the radio, these wonderful accidents. A man listens to your show and you wind up singing in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. How many people get that opportunity? The great poet Jim Harrison became a friend of mine because he'd heard the show in his cabin up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I got to meet him. I got to meet George Plimpton at a party, who listened to the show and told me all about his youthful years in Paris when he lived in a tool shed. He was sleeping on an army cot. He was founding the Paris Review and interviewing E.M. Forster and Ezra Pound and Ernest Hemingway. And he said, George Plimpton said to me, I envy you getting to talk to all those people on the radio. People hear my voice and they get their backs up. They hear Harvard snob when I talk. But I tell you, friendship is what it's all about. It's all it's ever been about. He said, all my deepest regrets are about people I missed my chance to get to know. And it's always for the dumbest reasons. Well, it was a wonderful career, and so that's why I wrote about it. I ended the memoir with a poem as well. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, that which I see clearly in my peers, who disappear at New Year's to escape the cold. My classmates with white hair and gizmos in their ears. In me thou seest a former tennis player and devotee of biking, hiking, sailing, now hesitate when heading down the stair and take a firm hold of the railing. In me thou seest a formerly swift mind, once given to riposte and repartee. Now he resorts to Googling to find the word for confusion that begins with D. This thou perceivest and regard with gentle scorn, but your time will come as sure as you were born. Thank you for listening. Thank you.